It's okay. As mentioned last week, we began this new study of the book of Exodus, and we looked at some background information about the book itself, some issues concerning the authorship. And Moses is the name that's most closely associated with Exodus and with the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And references being made to Moses, which we find elsewhere in the Old Testament and in the New Testament as well, where Moses' authorship of these books is attributed to him. We also looked at some information, a little bit of information about the history of Egypt, and to try to provide some background details on what life might have been like for the Israelites there in Egypt. Well, this evening we get into the text itself of the book, and we'll be looking at chapter 1. And chapter 1 of the book of Exodus presents us with a dark period in the history of the Israelites. We see the Israelites being humiliated and oppressed as they are brought in servitude to the Egyptians. However, the chapter also sets the scene for the deliverance that God would soon bring about, as we learn about the condition from which the Israelites would be redeemed. We'll begin here reading the first 7 verses of Exodus chapter 1. And it says this: "These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan and Naphtali; Gad and Asher. All the offspring of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the descendants of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them." The opening 7 verses of the chapter here repeat some of the information that's already been given in the book of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 35, verses 22 to 26, we have another list there of the names of the sons of Jacob. Genesis 35, the last part of verse 22 begins, "Now the sons of Jacob were 12," and then we have the same list of names of the sons there in those verses as well. And then also in Genesis chapter 46, that's verse 8, again, another list of the names and the descendants of Jacob. "Now these are the names of the descendants of Israel who came into Egypt, Jacob and his sons." And then we go into that list that we have there. And then down in verses 26 and 27 at the end of that list in chapter 46, we're told there, "All the persons belonging to Jacob who came into Egypt, who were his own offspring, not including Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all, and the sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2. All the persons of the house of Jacob that came into Egypt were 70. And then in chapter 50 and verse 26, right at the end there, we have the death of Joseph recorded again there. "So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt." So that information that we have there in Genesis is brought together here in the opening verses of the book of Exodus. And the opening verses really provide the link between Genesis and Exodus, the continuation of the story. And in the Hebrew text, the very first word of the book of Exodus is the word "and." It's not translated in our versions, doesn't tend to be, but the first word is "and." We were always told at school that you shouldn't begin a sentence with the word "and," but in this case, the book does begin with that word "and." Again, that indicates the continuation of the story between Genesis, the end of Genesis, and the beginning of Exodus. So we see in these opening verses that all of Jacob's sons and their households went to Egypt. And we know from the book of Genesis that the reason why they'd gone to Egypt was because of the famine that had affected that region. There was the famine in Canaan, and Jacob's sons had been down to Egypt on a couple of occasions to try and buy food. And then eventually, when Joseph revealed his identity to them, that allowed then Jacob and the whole family to move down there into Egypt under the care of Joseph. So those were the circumstances that led the family, and the emphasis here upon the whole family going down to Egypt. The names of the sons that are listed there in these opening verses are listed according to their mothers. So the first six there are Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. These were all of the sons of Jacob by his wife Leah. Benjamin, the next on the list, was Jacob's son by Rachel. And of course, Joseph was Rachel's other son, but he's not included at that point in the list. He's mentioned at the end of the list at verse 5 because he's already in Egypt. And then Dan and Naphtali, the next names on the list, were Jacob's sons by Rachel's maid Bilhah. And the final two, Gad and Asher, were Jacob's sons by Leah's maid Zilpah. Verse 5 notes that Jacob's offspring were 70 in number. And we read a moment ago from Genesis chapter 46, verses 26 and 27, which gives the number of 66, to which then must be added Jacob, Joseph, and Joseph's two sons, which would make again 70 in all. And in Deuteronomy, the number is given as well as 70. Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 22. It's one of Moses' speech here to the people. Your fathers went down to Egypt 70 persons, and now the Lord your God has made you as the stars of heaven for multitude. So again, Moses reminding the people there that to begin with, they were just 70 persons who were there in Egypt. Interestingly, in the book of Acts, in Stephen's speech, in Acts chapter 7 and verse 14, Stephen in his speech there gives the number as 75. Acts chapter 7 verse 14. Stephen is recalling here the history of Israel as he makes this speech. Verse 13, he says, at the second visit, Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to Pharaoh. And Joseph sent and called to him Jacob his father and all his kindred, 75 souls. And Jacob went down into Egypt. So Stephen mentions 75 there, and that number, 75, comes from the Septuagint version of Genesis chapter 46 and verse 27. The Septuagint was the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, produced around the 2nd century BC. And it's slightly the text is slightly different in the Septuagint. So Genesis chapter 46 and verse 27 in the Septuagint gives the figure of 75, and that's probably what Stephen would have been familiar with. That would have been the version he had been using, and that's why in his speech he gives 75. And the number 75 probably includes 5 grandsons of Joseph. And again, in the Septuagint text, those names are included. They're not included in the Hebrew text, which our Old Testament is based upon. So that's where that variation in the numbering comes from there. That probably the 75 is including Joseph's grandsons as well. Well, verse 6 then records the death of Joseph and his brothers and all of that generation. And then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. So they've all dead now. Their lives have come to an end. So that's the end of that generation. And then verse 7 continues, but the descendants of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. And that verse really covers a period of about 400 years, just summarized in that verse there. Chapter 12, verse 40 will tell us that there were Israel was in Egypt for 430 years. Exodus chapter 12, verse 40 says that the time that the people of Israel dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. So that period is summarized there in verse 7 of chapter 1. And during this time, the Israelites were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So we've got population growth occurring here. And the terms that are used here are terms that are used of God's creation in Genesis chapter 1. The same words are used in Genesis chapter 1, verse 20, which records the fifth day of creation with the birds and the fishes. God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the firmament of the heavens. So the swarms there, that's the idea of the growth of the Israelite population, just as the swarms of these living creatures came forth there on the fifth day. In verse 21 as well, God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm. And verse 22, God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters in the sea. So we see the creation being fruitful and multiplying, and the same was happening to the Israelites there in Egypt as well. And that was the instruction that God gave in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, after the creation of mankind. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. So mankind as well, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And that's what's happened with the Israelites there in Egypt. In Numbers, the book of Numbers, chapter 1, in verses 45 and 46, the total number of the men of Israel who were 20 years old and above, who left Egypt, is given there as being 603,550. It's Numbers chapter 1. Verse 45. So the whole number of the people of Israel by their fathers' houses, from 20 years old and upward, every man able to go forth to war in Israel, their whole number was 603,550. So that's just the men who are aged 20 and over, and to that you would have to add the women and the children as well. So perhaps at a guess of something perhaps like 2 million people who would have left Egypt there. And so the population grew from this original group of 70, perhaps to something like 2 million. Again, that's a number of 600,000 is given in Exodus chapter 12, verse 37 as well. The people of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. So the number of men given there, roughly 600,000 plus the women and the children, however many that would have been. The land that was filled with the Israelites, that's mentioned there in verse 7, that the land was filled with them, was probably referring to the land of Goshen, which was where the Israelites had originally settled when they came into the land, and that's the region in which they continued to live. In Genesis chapter 47 and verse 27 says, thus Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied exceedingly. So again, their mention of the population growth there also. Well, we'll read on here, verses 8 to 14 now of Exodus chapter 1. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war befall us, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens, and they built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramesses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they made the people of Israel serve with rigor, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they made them serve with rigor. So after the passing of a period of time, a new king arose in Egypt, who we're told did not know Joseph. This new king had no knowledge of Joseph or of what Joseph had done for Egypt, how he had served Egypt. Again, looking at Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7, Stephen makes mention of this as well in Acts chapter 7, verses 17 to 19. He says this, But as the time of the promise drew near, which God had granted to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt, till there arose over Egypt another king who had not known Joseph. He dealt craftily with our race and forced our fathers to expose their infants that they might not be kept alive. So Stephen making reference to this in his speech there as well. The new king isn't named, known as we've noted last week, that none of the names of the pharaohs are given. They're all treated as if they were alike. So those who accept the later date for the Exodus, which is around 1290 BC, might identify this king who didn't know Joseph as Seti I, who was the father of Ramesses II. Those who accept the early date of the Exodus, about 1440 BC, would identify this king as one of the Hyksos rulers. And as we mentioned last week, the Hyksos were these foreigners who came in and they took over the Egyptian throne. So that would fit with that period there. But again, we can't be certain over these names or even the date of the Exodus itself. But these are suggestions that you might come across. Well, the Egyptian king who didn't know Joseph felt threatened by the growth of the Israelite population. In verse 9, he says, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. So there is a fear here, a fear that the Israelites are becoming too powerful, that they're taking over. That they're still regarded, although they've been there for a long time, they're still regarded as outsiders. And the growth of the population is instilling this fear and dread amongst the Egyptians. That, and in particular, that if Egypt were to become involved in a war with their enemies, that the Israelites might make an alliance with the enemies and fight against them and escape from the land. And so the Pharaoh suggests that they should deal shrewdly with the Israelites. And we see what that means in verse 11 here, that the answer to the problem, he seems to think, is to put the Israelites to hard labor. They set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. This had been predicted to Abraham. God had spoken to Abraham that this would happen in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13, where the Lord said to Abraham, as his name is there, know of a surety that your descendants will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be slaves there, and they will be oppressed for 400 years. So that had been predicted there to Abraham by God, and now we see that being fulfilled. So the Israelites would provide this ready supply of labor for Pharaoh's building projects at Pithom and Ramesses. Forced labor was something that was quite common in the ancient world. The Egyptians used it to build their pyramids and these other great building projects. And even within Israel, later on in their history, in the time of David and in the time of Solomon, there was forced labor. In 2 Samuel chapter 20 and verse 24, we see that David had appointed someone to be in charge of the forced labor. 2 Samuel chapter 20 verse 24, a man named Adoram was put in charge of the forced labor. And he appears again in 1 Kings chapter 5. In the time of Solomon, Solomon used forced labor to bring his building supplies and to build the temple. 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 13, which says, King Solomon raised a levy of forced labor out of all Israel, and the levy numbered 30,000 men, and he sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in relays, and they would be a month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoram was in charge of the levy. He's mentioned again there. So this idea of forced labor was something that was used in the ancient world for these sorts of building projects. And the Israelites here are put to the task of building these cities of Pithom and Ramesses. And on the map here, we can see the location. It's not certain where these places are. There's been no sort of archaeological evidence for them. There's some uncertainty over exactly where they are, but these are suggestions here that they're in the land of Goshen, which is, of course, where the Israelites are settled. So these are the cities that they were involved in building. And they're referred to as being store cities. And so it would be in these cities that goods and military supplies would be stored. Again, we see Solomon doing that kind of thing during his reign as well, building or using cities to store his military, sort of a garrison town kind of thing. So this was Pharaoh's plan then, was to put the Israelites to labor, to force labor, to wear them out, I suppose, and grind them down in that way. But his policy did not succeed. This policy of enslavement did not prevent the growth in the population of the Israelites. In fact, it was the opposite. We're told here in verse 12 that the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and the more they spread abroad. Verse 12 there again would imply the passing of a further period of time, perhaps, for the population to continue to grow in that way. So time is condensed there into that statement in verse 12. And then in verses 13 and 14, Pharaoh again tries to intensify the oppression and to make things worse for the Israelites. Verse 13 says, so they made the people of Israel serve with rigor and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work they made them serve with rigor. So they're put to hard labor here. Mortar and brick being mentioned there, perhaps in the making of bricks or in building those building projects and working in the field as well. So this is physical manual labor that they're involved in here. We'll read on now verses 15 to 22 of Exodus chapter 1. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and are delivered before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So drastic measures are ordered by the king of Egypt to deal with this problem, as he sees it, of the population growth of the Israelites. Again, the king's name, Pharaoh's name isn't given, but the names of two Hebrew midwives are given, Shiphrah and Puah. The phrase there may be that they are midwives to the Hebrews, or they are midwives who were Hebrews. So they could have been Egyptian women who served as midwives to the Hebrews, or Hebrew women who were midwives. And it's probably the latter, as the names there are not Egyptian names, but they are Semitic names, which would perhaps suggest that they were Hebrews rather than being Egyptians. The Hebrew word translated as midwife here means one who helps to bear. And their role would have been similar to that of a midwife today, assisting the mother in giving birth, cutting the umbilical cord, washing the child after it has been born. And the things that were involved after the birth of a child are mentioned in by the prophet Ezekiel in Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 4, where Ezekiel is using an illustration here of a birth where the baby hasn't been taken care of as it should have been, and he mentions the things that had been neglected at the birth. Ezekiel chapter 16 verse 4, as for your birth, on the day you were born, your navel string was not cut, nor were you washed with water to cleanse you, nor rubbed with salt, nor swathed with bands. So those would be the things that would normally be done at birth. But Ezekiel is using that as an illustration of something. But we note there the kind of things that the midwife would be involved in doing, taking care of the newborn baby. Mention of midwives is seen a couple of times in the book of Genesis as well. Genesis chapter 35 and verse 17, which is concerning Rachel here and the birth of Benjamin. Rachel goes into labor, and it's a difficult labor for her. Verse 17 says, and when she was in her hard labor, the midwife said to her, fear not, for now you will have another son. So we see the presence of a midwife there to try to assist Rachel in the birth of her son. Sadly, Rachel dies in childbirth there. And then also in Genesis chapter 38 and verse 28, another mention of a midwife here. This is with Tamar, and she's about to give birth to twins. When she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and bound on his hand a scarlet thread, saying, this came out first. So again, just noting the presence of the midwife there at that birth as well. So the Hebrew midwives here are there, and they're there to assist in the birth at the time of the birth. The two are mentioned, two are named there. We don't know it was that the full number, or is it just that they're only those two are the ones who are actually named, that there may have been other midwives as well, especially if the population was so big. It seemed a small number of midwives to be dealing with such a large number of population there. The mention is made there of the birth stool as well, and the birth stool would be two bricks or stones on which the woman would crouch or squat in order to give birth. So the king orders then that if the Hebrew women give birth to sons, the midwives are to kill the sons. But if they give birth to daughters, they're allowed to live. And of course, that would be to go against the midwife's role. Her role is to help to bring life into this world. She's there to help, to assist in that, to preserve life. But the instruction being given to the midwives is that they were to kill the male babies. But the midwives here refuse to carry out this order, and they let the male children live. And verse 17 says that they would not carry out the king's order because they feared God. They had a respect and reverence for God. So their fear of God was greater than their fear of the king. But the king became aware that his order was not being followed. The male children were not being killed. And so he called in the midwives for an explanation and asked them, "Why have you done this and let the male children live? Why aren't you doing as I've told you to do?" And in their answer, the midwives claim that the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. Hebrew women are vigorous or stronger, and the babies are delivered before the midwives arrive. Well, that may or may not have been true. Perhaps that was the case, and that they turned up, the baby had already been born. But in refusing to carry out the order of the king, the Hebrew wives showed great courage here, that they would not do that. And as a consequence, the midwives are blessed by God and blessed with families of their own, because they refused to take human life. They had a respect for human life, and they wouldn't do as the king demanded. And so we're told that the population continued to grow and became very strong. So the population growth continues on there. But Pharaoh still feels threatened by the continuing growth in the Hebrew population. And now his plan to enslave them hadn't worked. His plan for the midwives to kill off the male children, that hadn't worked. And so now he tries to involve his own people in the extermination of the male Hebrew babies. And in verse 22 there, he commands the people that sons born to the Hebrews were to be cast into the Nile. But again, the daughters were allowed to live. So casting them into the Nile, it would bring about their death, that they would drown in the Nile. And killing the males, leaving the females, killing the males would eliminate Israelite military strength, that these male babies would not grow into men who could serve in the military. And so then over time, this would lead to the extinction of the Israelites there in Egypt. So chapter 1 shows us setting the scene really for what's about to come in the next chapters, with the birth of Moses in particular. But it shows us that despite the dangers and threats to the people of Israel, they're prospering in Egypt because God is fulfilling the promise that he made to Abraham, that they would become a great nation. That God is blessing them despite the hardship that they are enduring. And 3 times in the chapter we're told that the people grew and multiplied, in verse 7, in verse 12, and in verse 20. So however bleak things may look, or whatever hardship their people may be going through, God is at work here, and God has a plan. And the chapter is setting the scene for us for the birth of Moses and the circumstances in which Moses would be born, as we shall see next week in chapter 2. So we'll stop here.